Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little. Hope you're having a fantastic day. I'm currently traveling, so we may have slight technical difficulties here and there, but I will do my best to make this function properly. If you all can hear me, please let me know. We'll go ahead and get started. Today we're going to be discussing choosing the correct bet size on the flop. This is obviously a gigantic question, but I've done my best to try to figure out ways to make it relatively simple for you. So here's the question that one of you asked. You never know how much to bet on the flop. What should I be considering? So this really is a giant portion of what poker is. You really just need to know when you should bet, which also means when you should check, and also how much you should bet. There are some older games called Limit Hold'em and limit games in general where you don't have to pick how much to bet. You only have one option, which makes the game a million times easier. But in No Limit Hold'em, you get to bet literally any amount you want. You get to pick. So for the tournament masterclass I have coming up, this chart is going to be in it. Let's go through it line by line. I'll explain how to use this. Okay, so as the pre-flop aggressor on the flop, this is when you raise before the flop, your opponent called, the flop comes, and you are going to be betting. They could either have checked you when you were in position, or you can be out of position whenever you raise and they call you from, let's say, on the button. So, first things first, frequency. How often are we going to be betting? That is over here. So, are we in position or out of position? Now, this is going to be a bit of an oversimplification, but I show you in the masterclass how to go through and figure out all these numbers yourself. But essentially, you want to ask, do I have a strong range advantage, a moderate range advantage, or a weak to no range advantage? Okay? So what is strong range advantage? So let's just take a look at a particular spot. We raise in position, big blind calls, flop comes ace, king, jack, they check. It should make a lot of logical sense here that the opponent is going to have fewer of the good, strong ace high and big card hands than we do, pretty much no matter where we raise from. Now, as we raise from earlier and earlier position, our range advantage is going to get higher and higher, and that's going to result in us having a very, very strong range advantage. So in this scenario, on ace, king, jack, or king, jack 2, or queen, queen 5, you're going to find that the pre-flop aggressor in position after the big blind checks is going to want to bet very close to 100% of the time. Now, notice here I do have in position listed. If the small blind calls, these ranges will be slightly different. We're basically presuming in this scenario we raise from somewhere before the flop and the big blind calls. So in this scenario, we want to be betting very frequently. Now, if we have a smaller range advantage, we probably have something like 56% equity against our opponent's range, roughly. Obviously, if you raise from under the gun, it's going to be different than if you raise from the button. But on these boards, 7-7-6, 8-5-3, 4-3-2, you're usually going to want to bet a decent amount of the time, between like 40 and 80%. I know that's a big spread, but we could break this down substantially further, but then you have to really, really nail down which specific ranges you were discussing. But in this scenario, you're going to want to be betting moderately, roughly half the time, between half and 80% of the time, clearly. And then when you have no range advantage, like on 9-7-5 or 7-6-5, you're going to want to be checking a lot. And in that scenario, this is where the standard poker coaching method of teaching you to bet with the premium made hands and draws and checking the marginal made hands and junk really comes into play. In this scenario here where it's moderate, you're going to want to be checking. Well, you're still going to want to bet some of your marginal made hands, like, top pair, even second pair is pretty good if you have a little bit of a range advantage. And then when you have a big range advantage, you just bet with everything. So you'll notice from out of position, you basically never have a strong range advantage. Now, again, this depends on which ranges you're against. If you know you're going to raise under the gun and the button's going to call you with all sorts of garbage, like 9-5 suited, well, then there are going to be boards where you have a strong range advantage. But normally if you raise and then someone in position calls you from the button, cutoff, hijack, low jack, whatever, they're going to have something pretty decent, which means you're essentially never going to have a big range advantage, which means you're basically never going to be betting 100% of the time when you are out of position. Which, makes some logical sense. I mean, think about it. Say it does come king, jack 2. The pre-flop caller in position is going to have something a decent amount of the time. If you're hearing this chair squeak, sorry, I'm in a rental home right now. It's a very, very old home built in the 1800s, and they apparently have not updated the chairs in a long time. Maybe since the 1800s, so they squeak. And my computer's on top of a dresser because I guess they didn't have desks back then. So anyway, sorry for all the noises. In this scenario, though, you're going to want to be checking at least some portion of the time, which means you're pretty much always going to want to be betting with your premium made hands and draws, checking your marginal made hands and junk. The real question just becomes, what is defined as a premium hand? And it depends pretty much on the ranges at work, right? As your opponent's range in position gets weaker and weaker, just because they call wider or perhaps 3-bet a specific strategy, then that's going to impact how wide you go for value, which also impacts how wide you can go for bluffs. And then in scenarios where you don't have a range advantage, or it's somewhere near neutral, like queen, queen, 5, this is a spot where you want to be doing a whole lot of checking. And understand, you can't just say, oh, always bet the paired boards, because notice here, if you raise and the big blind calls, the initial raiser has all the good queens, whereas the preflop caller may or may not have the good queens and may or may not also have the really bad queens. So the preflop raiser is going to have a big range advantage when they're raising from in position. But when you're raising from out of position, notice the player on the button is going to very often call with ace, king, king, queen, queen, jack, queen 10 suited, queen 9 suited, right? So your opponent actually has a whole lot of queens in their range. So it really is not as easy as always bet queen, queen, 5 as the preflop raiser, because sometimes you're in great shape and sometimes you're not. You have to spend some time and get familiar with how ranges interact. Okay? So now that we know that, this is going to determine how often we want to be betting. And when you are betting, you're always betting premium made hands and draws, and you are checking marginal made hands and junk. In this scenario, it's like bet 100% premium made hands and draws, and maybe you check, 50% marginal made hands and junk, and you bet the other 50%. And then up here on the top, you're just betting everything, so it's 100% of everything. All right, so now that we know when to bet, now we need to figure out the size. First things first, range advantage. Do we have the range advantage? Yes, that would be this top instance over here, these instances to some extent. Next, you want to ask, do you have the nut advantage? Okay, good example of this, 776. On 776, we have the range advantage as the in-position preflop raiser, but we do not have the nut advantage because we don't have very many 7s, whereas the big blind caller is going to have a lot of 7s, right? So in this scenario, no, we don't have the nut advantage. So in this situation, we're going to want to be betting small. If we do have the nut advantage, like on ace, king, jack, now you want to ask, what is the range connectivity of the opponent? Okay? What that means, essentially, again, I explain all this in the course, but essentially, you want to ask, how well does the opponent's continuing range connect with the board? On ace, king, jack, it actually connects pretty well. If the opponent has 9-8 of clubs, they're just going to fold to any bet, right? So we don't care about those hands. But if the opponent does have an ace or a king or a jack with a gut shot, they're going to call basically any bet. So in this scenario, we want to be betting on the larger side. But if you look at queen, queen, 5, now the opponent's going to have a whole lot of hands like ace high and king high and backdoor straight draws, right? So now, a lot of their continuing range is quite weak. They don't have very good range connectivity, so now we want to be betting small. So see how we just follow the chart down. Also, if we do not have the range advantage, that implies we're betting infrequently. When you're betting infrequently, you're betting with a very polarized range. When you're betting with a polarized range, you want to be betting big. So if we lack the range advantage, just bet big. If we do have the range advantage, you have to go through this. Do we have the nut advantage? If the answer is no, just always be betting small for the most part. If we do have the nut advantage, we want to ask how well does the opponent connect with the board. Now, obviously, this is not going to very clearly nail down every single situation you could possibly be in. There are going to be some spots where you want to be betting bigger. Some of these connected boards, depending on your position, you are going to want to bet big despite not really having the nut advantage. So this is not perfect. But my goal is not to teach you to play very perfectly like a solver. My goal is to teach you how to play a strategy that is very, very fine, that is going to be better than basically everything your opponents are going to do, that you can also implement in-game. And I know this is a bit much, but it actually is implementable in-game. This is what I do every single time I play any hand, and it works out pretty great for me. Next, facing a flop bet. Another image from the course. So this is when our opponent bets. Pretty much, position does not matter all that much in this instance. Besides, you get to defend wider when you're in position. So first things first, facing a bet, what is our hand type? Do we have junk? If we have junk, just fold. Clean and easy, huh? You have junk, don't play. If we have a marginal made hand, we're going to want to call. And again, this is where it's important to be able to very correctly define what a marginal made hand is. Understand that when you are in position, marginal made hands, in quotations, gets wider. So if you're in the big blind, like say someone raises, you call the button, or say someone raises, you call the big blind, and the flop comes. If they bet, the hands you get to defend with out of position, well, that range should be tighter than the range you defend with in position, assuming your opponent makes the same size bet. And that's just because you're in position, right? Being in position, you get to play a wider range. So you're going to have to correctly classify your hands slightly differently based on your position. Next, premium made hand or draw. Do we have the nut advantage? If we do not, like say under the gun raises, we call the big blind, it comes ace, king, jack. If I'm sitting there with a flush draw or with a straight, queen 10, we do not have the nut advantage here because our opponent has queen 10 suited, also aces, kings, jacks, ace, king, and ace, jack, whereas we're probably lacking aces, kings, and ace, king, right? So our opponent has the nut advantage here. Here, we do not get to raise with much of anything. Therefore, we want to call with basically our whole range that we're going to continue with. If we do have the nut advantage, though, like say it comes 7-7-6, well, now if we have a premium made hand or draw, we're going to want to be raising with a lot of that. Now, again, this is not always crystal clear. This chart's not always going to perfectly apply, but it is going to be somewhat close enough. Also, when you are shorter stacked, you get to call bets and raises a little bit wider. And the reason for that is because you get to realize your equity better, right? If you're very shallow, you're putting in, 1 or 2 big blinds to try to win a 8 big blind pot. And if you're shallow, you can pretty easily call a turn bet because you don't have any chips left and you're just always getting good pot odds. So as you're shallower, you get to generally defend a little bit wider. Also, your raise sizes become smaller when you do raise. When you're deeper, you generally have to call a little bit tighter because you're going to realize your equity poorly because your opponent can just bet the turn and bet the river. And when you are going to raise, you need to generally raise larger to cut off your opponent's pot odds plus implied odds. Also, there's a bit of an exception to this once we get really short. Then we may just want to be jamming all in instead of check raising small. So that's the answer. When to bet on the flop and when to check, and also how to generally defend against a bet in a flowchart organizational method. On the turn, let's talk about the turn real quick since we're here. Frequency on the turn. This is kind of the same thing generally applies, except for now you're very rarely going to have a strong range advantage on the turn. So you're pretty much always going to want to be checking some portion of the time on the turn as the pre-flop raiser who also bet the flop. And the reason for that is because when you bet the flop and your opponent calls or raises, or generally when they calls is what we're talking about here, when they call, it implies they no longer have the junk in their range, right? You can follow this chart here. Whenever we bet and the opponent has junk, they just fold. That means when they continue by calling, they either have a marginal hand or they have a premium made hand or a draw, depending on how they play them. So on the turn, knowing they have a premium made hand or draw, that's going to make the range advantage much closer. So you're either going to have a moderate advantage or little to no advantage. So in this situation, you are going to go over here on this side of the tree very frequently. So you're going to want to be betting less often, but usually with a bigger size on the turn. And same thing generally happens on the river to some extent, depending on how much money has gone in the pot and how the board runs out. There will be some boards that run out great for you that you get to bet all the time. Some boards will run out terrible for you that you don't get to bet very often. But this kind of thing generally applies. And also facing a bet from the opponent. Same story on the turn. As you start to get shallower, you may decide that you need to be going all in with some portion of your range. Usually that will start to happen on the turn because there's already been a pre-flop bet and a flop bet. So maybe you end up check raising sometimes. You still do get to call it decently wide, especially when we're deep stacked. And this all still applies. So that's the rough answer to this question. You never know much to bet on the flop. Well, here's the answer. You usually want to be betting small-ish when you do not have the nut advantage. And you want to be betting small whenever you do have the nut advantage and your opponent does not connect well with the board. That's going to be on something like queen, queen, 5. And you also... So that's when you want to bet small. And now you want to be betting large when you have the nut advantage and your opponent connects well with the board. That's going to be like on ace, king, jack. And you also want to be betting large when you're betting infrequently. Now, what is large? Large starts to become sometimes difficult to know. In general, as you get deeper, large becomes bigger and bigger. Usually you're not betting more than the size of the pot on the flop. Usually something like 75 to 85% pot is about the maximum you want to be betting on the flop. And then the minimum you want to bet on the flop, well, there are some spots where you want to be betting very small. Like say you're playing 25 big blinds deep. If you raise from early position and the big blind calls, and the flop comes, let's say, 10-3-3, there you have a big range advantage, but you lack the nut advantage, right? So there you have a big range advantage. Do you have the nut advantage? The answer is no. So here, because you don't have very many threes, and your opponent does have threes, right? So here you want to be betting small, but in this scenario, small is actually going to be something like 1 big blind. And that's because on top of not having the nut advantage, also the range connectivity is quite poor for your opponent on 10-10-3. They're just not going to have anything very often. So in that scenario, you can raise and then continuation bet 1 big blind into the, what would it be? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5.5 big blind pot. So you're betting 20-ish% pot, 18% pot. So small sometimes becomes very small. In general, though, as your stacks get shallower, you want to be betting smaller. As your stack gets deeper, you want to be betting bigger.